Hello and welcome to the second lesson in our course, Educational Psychology. In this video, we are going to talk about learning. Now, learning is generally defined as relatively permanent changes in behavior, skills, knowledge, or attitudes resulting from identifiable psychological or social experiences. A key feature in this definition is relative permanence. This means that changes do not count as learning if they are temporary. Like that one night when you can't walk straight and you talk funny after drinking a couple of bottles of beer, but can walk and talk properly the next day. Also, you do not learn a phone number if you forgot or if you forget it the minute after you dial the number. You don't learn to like vegetables if you only eat them when forced. Now, the changes has to last. Notice though that learning can be physical, social, or emotional as well as cognitive. You do not learn to sneeze by catching cold, but you do learn many skills and behaviors that are physically based, such as riding a bike or throwing a ball. You can also learn to like or even dislike a person even though this change may not happen deliberately. Now, it also seems that learning is not the same as teaching. Your teacher might be trying to teach you how to compute advanced math, but all you have learned is that you don't like math. Now, the distinction between learning and teaching is especially important for teachers to remember. An occupational hazard is what we do, or of what we do rather, is to confuse our efforts, that is teaching, with what the students get from our efforts, that is learning. So this lesson helps clarify this distinction by explaining several major theories of learning. We begin by explaining how the very circumstances of teaching can influence teachers' perception of learning and therefore also influence how they teach. Then we describe operant conditioning, a theory of learning based in a philosophical point of view called behaviorism, which is a perspective that emphasizes the link that can often be observed among overt behaviors and the circumstances of the behavior. Now, the variety of behaviorism called operant conditioning has been used by a number of educators to explain and organize management strategies for certain students, especially those with behavioral problems. Now, after discussing operant conditioning, we will discuss learning theories that emphasizes the inner thoughts of learners, a viewpoint often called constructivism. As we point out, as we will point out, there are varieties of constructivism. We describe two. One called cognitive constructivism that emphasizes the independence of learners' thinking, and another called social constructivism that emphasizes the student's need for social connections while learning. So, for teachers, learning usually refers to things that happen in schools or classrooms. Even though every teacher can, of course, describe examples of learning that happen outside these places. For example, a hotly contested topic is whether or not children learn violence when they play violent video games. For me, as for many educators, the term has a more specific meaning than for many people less involved in schools. In particular, teachers' perspective on learners or learning often emphasizes three ideas and sometimes even take them for granted. The first idea is that curriculum content and academic achievement. The second focuses on sequencing and readiness. And the third looks at the importance of transferring learning to new future situations. So let's look at them one by one. The first is viewing learning as dependent on curriculum. Now, when teachers speak of learning, they tend to emphasize whatever is taught in school deliberately. including both the official curriculum and the various behaviors and routines that make classroom run smoothly. In practice, defining learning in this manner often means that teachers will equate learning with the major forms of academic achievements, especially language and mathematics, and to a lesser degree, musical skills, physical coordination, or social sensitivity. Now, the imbalance happens not because the goal of public education makes teachers responsible for certain content and activities like books and reading, and the skills which these activities require, like answering learning modules and writing essays. It does not happen, or it does happen not, thankfully, because teachers are biased, insensitive, or unaware that students often learn a lot outside of school. A side effect of thinking of learning as related only to curriculum or academics is that classroom social interactions and behaviors become issue for teachers, become things that they need to manage. In particular, having dozens of students in one room or in one virtual room makes it more likely that I, as teacher, think of learning as something that either takes concentration to avoid being distracted by others, or that benefit from collaboration to take advantage of their presence. Now, in the small space of a virtual classroom or a classroom, no other viewpoint about social interaction makes sense. Yet, in the wider world outside of school, learning often does happen incidentally, accidentally, and without conscious interference or input from others. For example, I learn what a friend's personality is like without either of us deliberately trying to make this happen. As teachers, we sometimes see incidental learning in classroom as well, and often welcome it, but our responsibility for curriculum goals more often focuses our efforts on what students can learn through conscious, deliberate effort. Now, in classrooms, unlike in many other human settings, it is always necessary to ask whether classmates are helping or hindering individuals' learning. Focusing learning on changes in classroom has several other side effects. For example, is that one for example is that it can tempt teachers to think that what is taught is equivalent to what is learned, even though most teachers know that doing so is a mistake, and that teaching and learning can be quite different. If I assign a reading to my students about the Marcos dictatorship, it would be nice to assume not only that they have read the same words, but also learned the same content. But that assumption is not usually the reality. Some students may have read and learned all of what I assigned. Others may have read everything but misunderstood the material, like idolizing the dictator, or remembered only some of it, like the number of infrastructures built during his time, while totally forgetting or ignoring all the atrocities he committed and the amount of money he stole, which up until now we are paying with our own taxes. And still others, unfortunately, may have neither read nor learned much of anything, and instead went to watch TikTok videos and read CTTO posts on Facebook about how good a leader Marcos was and how the Philippines went into golden age during his time, in which no credible sources of information confirms. Now, chances are that my students will confirm this picture if asked confidentially. There are ways, of course, to deal helpfully with such diversity of outcomes. But whatever instructional strategies I adopt, they cannot include assuming that what I teach is the same as what students understand or retain of what I teach. Now, the second common perspective on learning for teachers is viewing learning as dependent on sequencing and readiness. Now, the distinction between teaching and learning creates a secondary issue for teachers, that of educational readiness. Traditionally, the concept referred to students' preparedness to cope with or profit from the activities and expectations of school. A kindergarten child was ready to start school, for example, if he or she is in good health, showed moderately good social skills, and could take care of personal physical needs like eating lunch or going to the bathroom unassisted. Could use a pencil to make simple drawings and so on. At older ages, such as in high school or university, the term readiness is often replaced by a more specific term, prerequisites. To take a course in physics, for example, a student must first have certain prerequisite experiences, such as studying advanced algebra or a calculus. To begin work as a public school teacher, a person must first engage in practice teaching for a period of time, not to mention also studying educational psychology, and must have passed the licensure exams for teachers. Now, note that this traditional meaning of readiness as preparedness focuses attention on students' adjustment to school and away from the reverse, the possibility that schools and teachers also have a responsibility of adjusting to students. But the latter idea is in fact a legitimate second meaning of readiness. If 5-year-old children normally need to play a lot and keep active, then it's fair to say that their kindergarten teacher needs to be ready for this behavior by planning for a program that allows a lot of play and physical activity. If she cannot or will not do so for whatever reason may there be, then in a very real sense, this failure is not the children's responsibility. Among older students, the second teacher-oriented meaning of readiness makes sense too. If a teacher has a student with disability, for example, the student has visual impairment, then the teacher has to adjust her approach in appropriate ways, not simply expect a visually impaired child to sink or swim in her classroom. As you might expect, this sense of readiness is very important for special education. But the issue of readiness also figures importantly whenever students are diverse, which in most cases, most of the time. Now, the third common perspective on learning for teachers is viewing transfer as a crucial outcome of learning. Still, another result of focusing the concept of learning on classroom is that it raises issues of usefulness or transfer, which is the ability to use knowledge or skills in situations beyond the ones in which they are acquired. Learning to read and learning to solve arithmetic problems, for example, are major goals of the elementary school curriculum because those skills are meant to be used not only inside the classroom but outside as well. We teachers intend that is for reading and arithmetic schools to transfer, even though we also do our best to make the skills enjoyable while they are still being learned. In the world inhabited by teachers, even more than in other worlds, making learning fun is certainly a good thing to do. But making learning useful as well as fun is even better. Combining enjoyment and usefulness is in fact the gold standard of learning. We generally seek it for students even though we may not succeed at providing it all the time. Now, several ideas and priorities then affect how we teachers think about learning, including the curriculum, the difference between teaching and learning, sequencing, readiness, and transfer. Now, the ideas form a screen through which to understand and evaluate whatever psychology has to offer education. As it turns out, many theories, concepts, and ideas from educational psychology do make it through the screen of education, meaning that they are consistent with the professional priorities of teaching and helpful in solving important problems of classroom teaching. In the case of issues about classroom learning, for example, educational psychologists have developed a number of theories and concepts that are relevant to classrooms. In that, they describe at least some of what usually happens there and offer guidance for assisting learning. It is helpful to group the theories according to whatever they focus on, changes in behavior or in thinking. The distinction is rough and inexact, but a good place to begin. For starters, therefore, consider two perspectives about learning, called behaviorism, which I mentioned earlier, which is learning as changes in overt behavior, and constructivism, learning as changes in thinking. Now, the second category can be further divided into psychological constructivism, changes in thinking resulting from individual experience, and social constructivism, changes in thinking due to assistance from other people. Now, the rest of the video will describe key ideas from each of these viewpoints. As I hope you will see, each describes some aspects of learning, not just in general, but as it happens in classroom in particular. So each perspective suggests things that you might do in classroom to make students' learning more productive. Now, behaviorism is a perspective on learning that focuses on change in individuals' observable behaviors, changes in what people say or do. At some point, we all use this perspective, whether we call it behaviorism or probably something else. The first time, for example, I drove a car, I was concerned primarily with whether I could actually do the driving and not with whether I could describe or explain how to drive. For another example, during the height of the pandemic last year, my fiance and I tried baking. We were more focused on whether we could actually produce edible food in the oven than with whether we could explain our recipes and baking procedures to others. And still another example, one often relevant to new teachers. When I began my first year of teaching, I was more focused on doing the job of teaching on a day-to-day survival basis than in pausing to reflect on what I was doing. Now, note that in all of these examples, focusing attention on behaviors instead of on thoughts have been or may have been desirable at the moment, but not necessarily desirable indefinitely or all the time. Even as a beginner, there are times when it's more important to be able to describe how to drive or how to cook than to actually do these things. And there definitely are many times when reflecting on and thinking about teaching can improve teaching itself. But neither is focused on behavior, which is not necessarily less desirable than focusing on students' inner changes, such as gains in their knowledge or their personal attitudes. If you are teaching, you will need to attend to all forms of learning in students, whether inner or outward. In classrooms, behaviorism is most useful for identifying relationships between specific actions by students and the immediate precursors and consequences of the actions. It is less useful for understanding changes in students' thinking. For this purpose, we need theories that are more cognitive or thinking-oriented or social for that matter, like the ones I will describe later. This fact is not a criticism of behaviorism as a perspective, but just a clarification of its particular strength or usefulness, which is to highlight observable relationships among actions, precursors, and consequences. Now, behaviorists use particular terms or lingo, if you would like to call it like that, for these relationships. One variety of behaviorism that has proved especially useful for educators is operant conditioning. Speaking of which, operant conditioning is focused on how the consequences of a behavior affects the behavior over time. It begins with the idea that certain consequences tend to make certain behaviors happen more frequently. If I compliment a student for a good comment made during discussions, there is more of a chance that I will hear further comments from that students in the future. And hopefully, they will be good ones too. So, if a student tells a joke to classmates and they laughed at it, then the student is likely to tell more jokes in the future, and so on. So, operant conditioning, or rather the original research about this model of learning, was not done with people, but with animals. One of this pioneer, or one of the pioneers in the field, was a Harvard professor named B.F. Skinner, who published numerous books and articles about the details of the process and who pointed out many parallels between operant conditioning in animals and operant conditioning in humans. Skinner observed that behaviors of rather tame laboratory rats, not the unpleasant kind that sometimes live inside your kitchen cabinet, now he or his assistant would put them in a cage that contained little except a lever and a small tray just big enough to hold a small amount of food. Now, the animated image here, this is Skinner, the other one, somewhere here, is sometimes nicknamed the Skinner box. At first, the rat would sniff and wander around the cage at random, but sooner or later, it would happen upon the lever and eventually happen to press it. And presto, the lever releases a small pellet of food, which the rat would happily eat. Gradually, the rat would spend more time near the lever and press the lever more frequently, getting food more frequently in the process. Eventually, it would spend most of its time at the lever and eating its fill of food. The rat had discovered that the consequence of pressing the lever was to receive food. Skinner called the change in this rat's behavior as an example of operant conditioning and gave special names to different parts of the process. For example, he called the food pellets the reinforcement and the lever pressing behavior as operant because it operated on the rat's environment. Skinner and other behavioral psychologists experimented with using various reinforcers and operants. They also experimented with various patterns of reinforcements or schedules of reinforcements, as well as with various cues or signals to the animal about when reinforcements are available. It turned out that all of these factors, the operant, the reinforcer, or the reinforcement rather, the schedule, and the cues affect how easily and thoroughly operant conditioning occurred. For example, reinforcement was more effective if it came immediately after the crucial operant behavior, rather than being delayed, and reinforcement that happened intermittently or only part of the time caused learning to take longer but also caused it to last longer. So, since the original research about operant conditioning used animals, it's important to ask whether operant conditioning also describes learning in human beings, and especially in students inside the classroom. On this point, the answer is a resounding yes. There are countless of classroom examples of consequences affecting students' behavior in ways that resembles operant conditioning. Although the process certainly does not account for all forms of student learning. Consider the following examples. In most of them, the operant behavior tends to become more frequent on repeated occasions. First is a 7th grade boy makes a silly face, which is the operant, and at the girl sitting next to him. His classmates sitting around them giggled in response, which is the reinforcement. So, number 2 is a kindergarten child raises her hand in response to the teacher's question about a story, which is the operant. The teacher calls on her and she makes her comment, which is the reinforcement. A third example is a grade 12 student, a member of the basketball team too, shoots 300 free throws during practice, which is the operant. He notes the time it takes him as well as his made free throws, which is the reinforcements. These examples are enough to make several points about operant conditioning. The first point is that the process is widespread in classrooms, probably more widespread than teachers realize, and it even permeates outside the classroom. This fact makes sense given the nature of public education. To a large extent, teaching is about making certain consequences like praise or marks depend on students engaging in certain activities like reading certain materials or doing assignments. The second point is that learning by operant conditioning is not confined to any particular grade, subject area, or style of learning, but by nature happens in every imaginable classroom. The third point is that teachers are not the only persons controlling reinforcements. Sometimes they are controlled by the activity itself, as in the free throw example, or by classmates, as in the giggling example. This leads to the fourth point, that multiple examples of operant conditioning often happens at the same time. Because operant conditioning happens so widely, its effect on motivation are a bit complex. Operant conditioning can encourage intrinsic or doing an activity for its inherent satisfaction rather than for some separable consequence, to the extent that the reinforcement for an activity is the activity itself. When a student reads a book for the sheer enjoyment of reading, for example, he is reinforced by the reading itself. And we can say that his reading is intrinsically motivated. More often, however, operant conditioning stimulates both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation at the same time. So, the combining of both is noticeable in the examples in the previous part of this video. In each example, it is reasonable to assume that the student felt intrinsically motivated in some partial extent, even when reward came from outside the student as well. This was because part of what reinforced their behavior was the behavior itself. Whether it was making faces, shooting hoops, or contributing to a discussion. So at the same time though, now note that each student probably was also extrinsically motivated, meaning that another part of the reinforcement came from outside or consequences or experiences not inherently part of the activity or the behavior itself. The boy who made face was reinforced not only by the pleasure of making face, for example, but also by the giggles of classmates. The basketball player was reinforced not only by the pleasure of shooting hoops, but also by knowledge of his improved speed and free throw percentage. Note that the extrinsic part of the reinforcement may sometimes be more observable or noticed than the intrinsic part, which by definition may sometimes only be experienced within the individual and not also displayed outwardly. This latter fact may contribute to an impression that sometimes occurs within teachers that operant conditioning is really just bribery in disguise. So that only external reinforcements operate on students' behaviors. It is true that external reinforcement may sometimes alter the nature of strength of intrinsic motivation, but it is also not the same as saying that it destroys or replaces intrinsic motivation or reinforcement. But more about that issue later. Now, operant conditioning is made more complicated but also more realistic by several additional ideas. They can be confusing because the ideas have names that sound rather ordinary but that have special meanings in the framework of operant theory. Among the most important concepts to understand are the following: extinction, generalization, discrimination, schedules of reinforcement, and cues. Now, extinction refers to the disappearance of an operant behavior because of lack of reinforcement. A student who stops receiving gold stars or compliments for prolific reading of library books, for example, may extinguish or decrease or even stop book reading behavior. A student who used to be reinforced for acting like a clown in class may stop clowning once classmates stop paying attention to the antics. Generalization, on the other hand, refers to the incidental conditioning of behaviors similar to an original operant. If a student gets gold stars for reading library books, then we may find her reading more of other materials as well, like newspapers, comics, etc., even if the activity is not reinforced directly. The spread of the new behavior is similar to similar behaviors is called generalization. Now, generalization is a lot like the concept of transfer discussed earlier, in that it is about extending prior learning to new situations or contexts. From this perspective of operant conditioning, though, what is being extended or transferred or generalized is a behavior, not knowledge or skill. Now, the third thing, or the third key concept that we need to understand in operant conditioning is discrimination. Discrimination means learning not to generalize. In operant conditioning, what is not overgeneralized, that is, what is discriminated, is the operant behavior. If I am a student who is being complimented or reinforced for contributing to discussions, I must also learn to discriminate when to make verbal contributions from when not to make them, such as when other students are making their contributions or when the teacher is busy with other tasks. Discrimination learning usually results from the combined effect of reinforcement of the target behavior and extinction of similar generalized behaviors. In a classroom, for example, a teacher might praise a student for speaking during discussion, but ignore him for making very similar remarks out of turn. In operant conditioning, the schedule of reinforcement refers to the pattern of frequency by which reinforcement is linked with the operant. If a teacher praises me for my work, does she do it every time or only sometimes, frequently or only once in a while? In response or conditioning, however, this the schedule in question is the pattern by which the conditioned stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. If I am a student with Mr. Terror as my teacher, does he pout every time he is inside the classroom or only sometimes, frequently, or rarely? Now, behavioral psychologists have studied schedules of reinforcement extensively and found a number of interesting effects of different schedules. For teachers, however, the most important finding may be this part. Partial or intermittent schedule of reinforcement generally causes learning to take longer, but also causes extinction of learning to take longer too. This dual principle is important for teachers because so much of the reinforcements we give is partial or intermittent. Typically, if I am a teacher, I can compliment a student a lot of the time. For example, but there will always be inevitable occasions when I cannot be so because I am busy elsewhere or I am busy complimenting other students. For teachers concerned both about motivating students and about minimizing inappropriate behaviors, this is both good news and sadly a bad news. The good news is that the benefits of my praising students' constructive behaviors will be more lasting because they will not extinguish their constructive behaviors immediately. If I fail to support them every time these things happen, the bad news is that the students' negative behaviors may take longer to extinguish as well because those too may have developed through partial reinforcement. A student who clowns around inappropriately in class, for example, may not be supported by classmates' laughter every time it happened, but only some of the time. Once the inappropriate behavior is learned, though, it will take somewhat longer to disappear even if everyone, both teachers and classmates, makes a concerted effort to ignore or extinguish the behavior. Finally, behavioral psychologists have studied the effects of cues. In operant conditioning, a cue is a stimulus that happens just prior to the operant behavior and that signals that performing the behavior may lead to reinforcement. In the original conditioning experiments, Skinner's rats were sometimes cued by the presence or absence of a small electric light in their cage. Reinforcement was associated with pressing a lever when and only when the light was on. In classrooms, cues are sometimes provided by teachers deliberately and sometimes simply by the established routines of the class. Calling on a student to speak, for example, can be a cue that if the student does say something at the moment, then he or she may be reinforced with praise or acknowledgement. But if the cue does not occur, if the student is not called on, speaking may not be rewarded. In many or in more everyday non-behaviorist terms, the cue allows the student to learn when it is acceptable to speak and when it is not. Now, the behaviorist model of learning may be helpful in understanding and influencing what students do, but teachers usually also want to know what students are thinking and how to enrich what the students are thinking. For this goal of teaching, some of the best help comes from Constructivism, which is, as mentioned earlier, a perspective focused on how students actively create or construct knowledge out of their experiences. Constructivist models of learning differ about how much a learner constructs knowledge independently compared to how much she or he takes cues from other people who may be more of an expert and who may help the learner's effort. For convenience, these are called psychological constructivism and social constructivism. or sometimes called sociocultural theory. As explained in the next part of this video, both focus on individuals' thinking rather than their behaviors, but they have distinctively different implications for teaching. So, the idea of psychological constructivism is is that a person's learner learns by mentally organizing and reorganizing new information or experiences. The organization happens partially or partly by relating new experiences to prior knowledge that is already meaningful and well understood. Stated in these general forms, individual constructivism is sometimes associated with the well-known educational philosopher of the early 20th century, the American John Dewey. Although Dewey himself did not use the term constructivism in most of his writings, his point of view amounted to a type of constructivism, and he discussed in detail its implication for educators. He argued, for example, that if students indeed learn primarily by building their own knowledge, then teachers should adjust the curriculum to fit students' prior knowledge and interest as fully as possible. He also argued that the curriculum could only be justified if it related as fully as possible to the activities and responsibilities that students will probably have later after leaving schools. To many educators these days, his ideas may seem merely like good common sense, but they were indeed innovative and progressive at the beginning of the 20th century. Another recent example of psychological constructivism is the cognitive theory of Jean Piaget. Piaget believed that learning takes place when the individual knows that there is something he wants to know or do which he or she is currently not capable of knowing or doing. In other words, learning is the interplay between two mental activities that he called assimilation and accommodation. So, assimilation is the interpretation of new information in terms of pre-existing concepts, information, or ideas. A preschooler who already understands the concept of birds, for example, might initially label any flying object with this term, even butterflies, mosquitoes, and even flying cockroaches. Assimilation is therefore a bit like the idea of generalization in operant conditioning or the idea of transfer described earlier in this video. In Piaget's viewpoint, though, what is being transferred to a new setting is not simply a behavior, but a mental representation for an object or experience. Assimilation operates jointly with what is called as accommodation, which is the revision of modification of pre-existing concepts in terms of new information or experiences. The preschooler who initially generalizes the concept of birds to include any flying objects, for example, eventually revises the concept to include only particular kinds of flying objects, such as the Philippine eagle and Maya, and not others like mosquitoes or airplanes or flying cockroaches. For Piaget, assimilation and accommodation work together to enrich a child's thinking and to create what Piaget called cognitive equilibrium, which is a balance between reliance on prior information and openness to new information. At any given time, cognitive equilibrium consists of ever-growing repertoire of mental representations for objects and experiences. Piaget called each mental representation as schema. A schema was not merely a concept, but an elaborated mixture of vocabulary, actions, and experiences related to a concept. A child's schema for a bird, for example, includes not only the relevant verbal knowledge, like knowing how to define the word bird, but also the child's experiences with birds, pictures of birds, and conversations about birds. As assimilation and accommodation about birds and about other flying objects operate together over time, the child does not just revise and add to this vocabulary, such as acquiring a new word like butterfly, but also adds and remembers relevant new experiences and actions. From these collective revisions and additions, the child gradually constructs whole new schema or schemata for plural about birds, butterflies, other flying objects like flying cockroaches. In more everyday but also less precise terms, Piaget then might say that the child has learned more about birds. So here you can see how learning occurs according to Piaget's model. Note that his theory of learning is rather individualistic, in the sense that it does not say much about how other people involved with the learner might assist in assimilation or accommodating information. Parents and teachers, it would seem, are left lingering on the sideline with few significant responsibilities for helping learners to construct knowledge. But that pediatrician picture does nonetheless imply a role for helpful others. Someone, after all, has to tell or model the vocabulary needed to talk about and compare birds from airplanes, butterflies, and flying cockroaches. Piaget did recognize the importance of helpful others in his writing and theorizing, calling the process of supporting or assistance as social transmission. But he did not emphasize this aspect of constructivism. Piaget was more interested in what children and youth could figure out on their own, or so to speak, than in how teachers or parents might be able to help the young figure out. Partly for this reason, this theory is often considered less about learning and more about development, or long-term changes in a person resulting from multiple experiences that may not be planned deliberately. For that same reason, educators have often found Piaget's ideas especially helpful for thinking about students' readiness to learn. Another one of the lasting educational issues we have discussed earlier. We will therefore return to Piaget later to discuss development and its importance for teaching in more detail. Unlike Piaget's orientation to individuals' thinking in his version of constructivism, some psychologists and educators have explicitly focused on the relationship and interaction between a learner and other individuals who are more knowledgeable or experienced. This framework often is called social constructivism or sociocultural theory. An early expression of this viewpoint came from the American psychologist Jerome Bruner, who became convinced that students could usually learn more than had been traditionally expected as long as they were given appropriate guidance and resources. He called such support instructional scaffolding, literally meaning a temporary framework like the ones used in constructing buildings, and that allowed a much stronger structure to be built within it. Bruner believed in the importance of providing guidance in the right way and at the right time. When scaffolding is provided, students seem more competent and more intelligent, and they learn more. So, similar ideas were independently proposed by the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, whose writing focused on a child's or novice's thinking is influenced by relationships with other with other people who are more capable, knowledgeable, or expert than the learner. Vygotsky made a reasonable proposal that when a child or the novice is learning a new skill or solving a new problem, he or she can perform better if accompanied and helped by an expert than if performing alone, though still not as well as the expert. For example, someone who has played very little Mobile Legends will probably compete better if helped by an expert Mobile Legends player than if competing against opponents alone. So, Vygotsky called the difference between the solo performance or what is already known and assisted performance or what is not known as the zone of proximal development, or just ZPD for short, meaning, figuratively speaking, the place or area of immediate change, or what can be known with assistance. From this social constructivist perspective, learning is like assisted performance. Uh, During learning, knowledge or skills is found initially in the expert helper. If the expert helper is skilled and motivated to help, then the expert arranges experiences that let the novice to practice crucial skills or to construct new knowledge. In this regard, the expert is a bit like a coach of an athlete, offering help and suggesting ways of practicing, but never doing the actual athletic work himself or herself. Gradually, by providing continued experiences matched to the novice's learner's emerging competencies, the expert coach makes it possible for the novice or apprentice to appropriate or to make his or her own the skill or knowledge that originally resides only with the expert. So, let us look at some key differences between psychological constructivism and social constructivism and what they mean for you as a teacher. So, psychological and social constructivism have differences that suggest different ways for teachers to teach more effectively. The theoretical differences are related to three ideas in particular: the relationship of learning and long-term development, the role of meaning of generalization and abstraction during development, and the mechanism by which development occurs. So let's look at them one by one. First, by looking at the relationship or the difference when it comes to the relationship of learning and long-term development of the child. In general, psychological constructivism, such as that of Piaget, they emphasizes the ways that long-term development determines a child's ability to learn, rather than the other way around. The earliest stage of a child's life are thought to be rather self-centered and to be dependent on the child's sensory and motor interaction with the environment. When acting or reacting to his or her surrounding, the child has relatively little language skill initially. This circumstances limits the child's ability to learn in the usual school-like sense of the term. As development proceeds, of course, language skills improve and hence the child becomes progressively more teachable, and in this sense, more able to learn. But whatever the child's age, ability or to learn waits or depends upon the child's stages of development. From this point of view, therefore, a primary responsibility of teachers is to provide a very rich classroom environment. So, children can interact with it independently and gradually make themselves ready for verbal learning that is increasingly sophisticated. So, social constructivism or constructivists such as Lev Vygotsky, on the other hand, emphasizes the importance of social interaction in stimulating the development of the child. Language and dialogue, therefore, are primary, and development is seen as happening as a result. The converse of the sequence pictured by Piaget. Obviously, a child does not begin life with a lot of initial language skills. But this fact is why interaction need to be scaffolded with more experienced experts, or people capable of creating a zone of proximal development in their conversations and other interactions. In the preschool years, the experts are usually parents. After the school years begin, the expert broaden to include teachers. A teacher's primary responsibility is therefore to provide very rich opportunities for dialogue, both among children and between individual children and their teachers. Now, the second difference denotes the role of generalization and abstraction during development. Psychological constructivism tends to see a relatively limited role for abstract and hypothetical reasoning in the life of children, and even in the reasoning of youth and actually many adults. Such reasoning is regarded as an outgrowth of years of interacting with the environment very concretely. As explained more fully in the next video of this course, elementary age students can reason, but they are thought to reason only about immediate concrete objects and events. Even older youth are thought to reason in this way much or even at all the time. From this perspective, a teacher should limit the amount of thinking about abstract ideas that she expects from students. The idea of democracy, for example, may have been or may be experienced simply as an empty concept. At most, it might be misconstrued as an oversimplified, overly concrete idea as just about taking votes in class, for instance. Abstract thinking is possible according to psychological constructivism, but it emerges relatively slowly and relatively late in development, after a person accumulates considerable concrete experiences. Social constructivism see abstract thinking emerging from dialogue between a relatively novice or child or youth and a more experienced expert, a parent or a teacher. From this point of view, the more such dialogue occurs, then the more the child can acquire facility with it. The dialogue must, of course, honor a child's need for intellectual scaffolding or zone of proximal development. A teacher's responsibility can therefore include engaging the child in dialogues that uses potentially abstract reasoning, but without expecting the child to understand the abstraction fully at first. Young children, for example, can not only engage in science experiment like creating volcanoes out of baking soda and water, but also discuss and speculate about their observations of the experiment. They may not understand the experiment as an adult would, but that discussion can begin moving them towards adult-like understanding. Lastly, let's talk about the difference between psychological and social constructivism in how they see development. In psychological constructivism, as explained earlier, development is thought to happen because of the interplay between assimilation and accommodation, between when a child or youth can already understand or conceive of, and the change required of that understanding by new experiences. Acting together, assimilation and accommodation continually creates new states of cognitive equilibrium. A teacher can therefore stimulate development by provoking cognitive dissonance deliberately, by confronting a student with sights, actions, or ideas that do not fit with the student's existing experience and ideas. much like the Socratic method. In practice, the dissonance is often communicated verbally by posing questions or ideas that are new or that students may have misunderstood in the past. But it can also be provoked through pictures or activities that are unfamiliar to students. By engaging students in a community service project, for example, that brings them in contact with people who they had previously considered as strange or different from themselves. In social constructivism, as also explained earlier, development is thought to happen largely because of scaffolded dialogue in a zone of proximal development. Such dialogue is by implication less disturbing students' thinking than like stretching it beyond its former limits. The image of a teacher, therefore, is more of a collaborator with students' ideas rather than a challenger of their ideas or experience. In practice, however, the actual behavior of teachers and students may be quite similar in both forms of constructivism. Any significant new learning requires setting aside, giving up, or revising former learning. And this step inevitably, therefore, disturbs thinking, if only in the short term and only in a relatively minor way. Now, whether you think yourself of a psychological constructivist or a social constructivist, there are strategies for helping students help in development or in developing their thinking. In fact, the strategies constitute major portions of our future lessons and are a major theme throughout the entire pre-service teaching education program. So, in summary, although the term learning has many possible meanings, the term as used by teachers emphasizes its relationship to curriculum, to teaching, and to the issue of sequencing, readiness, and transfer. Viewed in this light, the two major psychological perspectives of learning, behaviorist and constructivist, have important ideas to offer educators. Within the behaviorist perspective, one of the most relevant theories is operant conditioning, which describes how the consequences and cues for a behavior can cause the behavior to become more frequent. Operant conditioning is especially relevant to understanding much of what students do. It offers less help in understanding how they think. Lastly, the other major psychological perspective, constructivism, describes how individuals build on construct knowledge by engaging actively within their experiences. Psychological constructivism emphasizes the learner's individual response to experience, their tendency both to assimilate it and to accommodate it. Social constructivism, on the other hand, emphasizes how others, more expert individuals, can create opportunities for the learner to construct new knowledge. Social constructivism suggests that the teacher's role must include deliberate, scaffolded dialogue. So this ends our lesson regarding the learning process. Thank you for watching, and my name is Dex Kamitan.